Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any absolute appeal to authority. Our guest today is the author and integrator Jeremy Lent. Jeremy grew up in the UK, but has spent most of his adult life in the US, where early in his career he was the founder, chairman and CEO of the internet company NextCard. His writings investigate the patterns of thought that have led civilization to its current crisis of sustainability. He is the founder of the non-profit Liology Institute, which is dedicated to a worldview that enables humanity to thrive sustainably. He is the author of Requiem of the Human Soul and the Patterning Instinct, the latter of which will be the topic of our discussion. Hello, Jeremy. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Thank you, Barry. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, well, I have to say, Jeremy, I found your book, The Patterning Instinct, quite staggering in its scope and vision. It covers a lot of ground in our cognitive history, from the first stirrings of symbolic thought to a potentially future genetically split humanity, and offers a potentially new way of being in the world. So it's not just a cognitive history of our species, but in a sense it's also a call to action. It's one of the most interesting books I've read in years, and I have so many questions I'd like to ask, but I realise we'll need to limit it to some of the main themes. So could you perhaps begin by telling us a bit about yourself and what it was that prompted you to write the book?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, Barry. And just in case anyone's curious about my accent, by the way, just to sort of get that on the table, I actually grew up in England.
Right.
And I left England after I graduated from Cambridge around 21. I spent basically most of my life since then in the United States. And so my accent has sort of got mashed somewhere along the line, so it doesn't quite fit anywhere. But anyway, in terms of what I did after I came to the States, the first part of my life was actually spent in business, and I started an internet company, in fact, and took it public. And then around 10 or so years ago, I went through a kind of I don't know, as you might call it, a spiritual crisis, if you will, but the things I built my life around sort of crushed around me. My wife at the time, who passed away some years back, got very sick. I left the company to look after her full time. The company then crashed, and I really lost her even years before she passed away because she had cognitive decline. And so I really felt that things I'd really built were gone. But I wanted to make sure that whatever I did with my life going forward was truly meaningful. Yeah. And then I started asking myself this question, well, what is meaning? And I didn't want to just take these received ideas that we're told as the truth. I wanted to make sure that whatever I put the rest of my life into was something that I had really decided was the right thing. So I started kind of peeling the onion, if you will, on these ideas that we have, these received ideas. And before long, I sort of looked for the book that the Patterning Instinct actually is. I was looking for some book to help guide me through these layers, realized there wasn't quite one around there. And as I started it was really like a detective puzzle, if you will, started to piece the things together myself. I thought it could be really valuable to turn it into a book for other people who are asking similar kinds of questions.
Okay, well, let's just dive straight in then. So in rough terms, what is the Patterning Instinct?
So the patterning instinct is what really makes us unique as humans compared to other mammals around us. And it's an instinct that we have to a far greater degree than other animals. And it's an instinct to pattern meaning into the otherwise sort of chaotic universe around us. And so we kind of see this instinct like in a newborn baby. And, nobody tells her, but within a few months, she's beginning to pattern some meaning into the words and touches and feelings, everything she gets, and starts to learn language, even though nobody says, hey, you're meant to learn language. Similarly, she learns the culture that she's growing up in. And way back when humans really first evolved as humans, as modern humans, and started to develop some kind of language, they would look at the at the universe around them, and similarly try to find some way of making meaning out of it. And that led ultimately to language, to culture, and to civilization.
Okay, so we often associate meaning in two ways, like sort of cognitive meaning, the meaning that you get out of a dictionary, and emotive meaning. But you're talking about meaning that is very much an embodied thing that unites those two ways of thinking about meaning then.
Yeah, it's interesting. So how does meaning and pattern relate to each other? Well, first off, I've thought a lot about what meaning actually is. And in a way, my take on meaning unites both of those two forms of meaning that you're talking about, because I see meaning as being a function of connectedness. So when we look up the meaning of a word in a dictionary, what essentially it's doing is it's giving us links to other words that we can then understand within our sort of network of understanding what that word means. So meaning is always a function of what it's connected to. And as human beings, we just like all other mammals on the earth, we get our core experience of life in an embodied way. So we start off as infants, there's warm and there's cold, there's hard and there's soft, there's up and there's down. And these are the things that actually are the core elements of our experienced meaning, what our life is about. So what's so fascinating, and this is work that I know that you're familiar with, that George Lakoff pioneered in the last couple of decades, a cognitive linguist, is this recognition that virtually all our abstractions, all our concepts that we as humans have to make sense of the world in an intellectual way comes from an embodied framework. And we can see this simply, essentially we use metaphors to make sense of the world. So things like, if I say to you about somebody I met yesterday, and I say, she gave me a warm smile. Well, she didn't actually give me anything. And when she smiled, it's not like the temperature in the room went up, but we know what I'm referring to because we all have these embodied experiences that then we conceptualize. And similarly, just the most abstract notions we see in the way cultures make meaning out of the world, like the sense of transcendence. Mm-hmm. Well, basically, transcendence comes from this core metaphor: up is good and down is bad, or whatever. Yeah. And so we everything comes back to these embodied ways in which we live our lives.
Okay, and why or in what ways has metaphor formed the way we've evolved?
Well, one of my early chapters is looking at language and how that came about. And my theory, if you will, but it's based on a number of ideas of the real experts in this field, but it kind of synthesizes some different approaches, is that when humans developed modern language, and that is probably sometime between 50 to 75,000 years ago, something in that range, we crossed what I call the metaphoric threshold, where we could get into this place of applying these metaphors to concepts around us. And that's where you see back in the Upper Paleolithic archaeology in Europe, you see this amazing flowering of symbolic expression of things, where we're beginning to connect things up in this ways, which allows us to make meaning in a much broader way than we ever could before. And I think metaphor plays a huge part in that, and really leads to these core underlying metaphors that form the root of all cultural complexes. So in fact, my book is structured looking at, say, hunter-gatherer times, agriculture, different big civilizational complexes, and it's structured by the root metaphors that I've identified that act as the foundation for the whole body of thought coming from that.
Okay, and then one of the main points that you want to put across is that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. What's the connection there with metaphor, and could you expand on that point a little bit?
Yeah, and that's really one of the discoveries I made as I did the research for this book. And well, to me and to some people, it might seem self-evident that cultures might shape history. That goes against the grain of sort of mainstream modern historical thinking, which is based on what's called geographic determinism, that essentially humans are the same everywhere, and the only thing that differentiates, say, the course of China's history from Europe's is just how the geography just happened to sort of work out. And I could go into that, but that's a whole sort of separate topic. But basically, the way that I see that relating to metaphor is these root metaphors lead to a very different sense that different cultures have of what we're meant to do in the world. So, for example, one of the biggest distinctions that I trace is between the East Asian, predominantly Chinese, ultimate root metaphor, which really saw the universe as what I call a harmonic web of life, where everything resonates with everything else. And when you have that view of the universe, your focus is on how to harmonize things. And you recognize that something I do, just like a spider's web that you might see in a tree in a forest, one little drop of rain or a leaf might reverberate through the whole web, and you can see that reverberation. So similarly, everything I do as a human, or humans do as a civilization, affects everything else around them. So the thing you want to do is not tear the web apart. You want to harmonize. And by contrast, the European core metaphor that I then trace into modern history turns out to be, it's based on a dualistic sense of a split human and a split universe, which then leads to this more modern metaphor of conquering nature. Humans are separate from nature and conquering it, which has led to our modern world. But that whole notion of relating to nature would be unthinkable, for example, to the traditional East Asian mind.
I'm just thinking, when I was a young man, I read this book by Eric Fromm, and I can't even remember the book, but one thing that has always stuck in my mind, he was talking about East and Western perspectives, and he gave the example of someone in the West, a poet actually, thinking how beautiful a flower was, and then picking it, and then taking it away, whereas in the East, that was unthinkable to actually pick the flower, but it was to recognize the beauty of that flower in situ, in a sense.
Yes, that is a beautiful distinction. And I think that really does get that sense that the Western mindset is nature is there as a resource for us, and we can admire it and then say, now how can we mine the gold most efficiently, and how can we turn this into a national park to maximize the number of people who get to see. I mean, so even the more positive aspects, we still get to see nature as a resource rather than something that we're meant to harmonize with. And we even see that in the modern environmental movement, where a lot of really progressive, well-meaning environmentalists use this modern metaphor of nature as ecosystem resources to try to persuade the capitalist world they need to take nature more seriously because it's a really valuable resource, and you can put billions of pounds or dollars of value on this particular thing here or there, which I think is a self-defeating metaphor.
Well, similarly, in the UK, there was a movement for people to actually engage in the green economy by arguing that it's cheaper to do so. But in some ways that potentially is self-defeating, because it activates a part of your way of thinking that is manipulative rather than the more, how should I put it, more holistic sort of big picture view of things. So you're still actually trying to see what you can get out of it by doing this, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. Because then you also open the door to any new technologist to come up and find a cheaper way of doing something that is destructive, and then say, well, we're basing our values on what's cheapest, and so here's a better approach. Yeah. To take one horrendous example is we look at, we're all aware now of the terrible global die-off of honeybees, of bees around the world. And then if you're into the sort of nature as a resource argument, you can say this is terrible because they pollinate so much agriculture that we need, for human survival. So it's a bad thing. And if you use that as the reason, somebody can come up and they're doing that, developing these little micro drones that they can then program to pollinate the trees instead. And so if somebody can come up with a cheaper drone system, they say, great, well, we've got a solution. Who cares about the bees anymore? So yeah, I think we have to recognize there's an intrinsic value in nature. And we have to make all of our arguments arise from that and from our place in the natural world rather than anything else. Otherwise, we're already giving the game away to this modern capitalist economy before we even begin.
So how did this split happen? Why did one stream of humanity go one way and another go another?
This is such a fascinating question, and it's one that was one of the core questions I really sort of tried to delve deeply into over the years. And I discovered that it was really with the ancient Greeks back about 2,500 years ago that a new way of looking at how humans were and what the universe was like emerged that we'd never seen before in all of history. And it was this notion that actually Plato was the most effective at describing it and popularizing it. But it was this notion of this split universe and a split human being. So rather than seeing everything as being connected, and, you know, all the way back through hunter-gatherer times and early agrarian civilizations, there was always this sense of everything was somehow one and connected at the same time. Everything was different, but also it was one unified whole. But Plato and some of the others around at that time came up with this notion that there was this actual dimensional split in the universe. There was this perfect, eternal, transcendent realm where everything was unchanging. And you had these abstract notions of the good existing there. And the world itself was more like this polluted, changeable world where everything was this kind of pale replica of the ultimate good that was up there in this transcendent realm. And what was so fascinating is that he saw humans as being equally split. So humans, we began to see having a soul that was our link with eternity and with divinity. And that soul was like trying to always be back in touch with perfection, and the body that was polluted and would just die and was corrupt. So we had the split within ourselves, which Plato and the people following him linked this kind of soul with reason and linked reason with divinity. And that split led to really the first systematic dualistic cosmology, which was really Christianity, which then gave birth. And this is something I found so fascinating, is that we've sort of trained to think nowadays of Christianity or religion and science as being in opposite camps. But something I discovered in my research was that Christianity actually served as an incubator for the scientific thought, for scientific cognition and the scientific revolution. So they actually, because they believed in reason as helping us to see the mind of God, it got to this amazing sense of through reason, through science, we could be in touch with understanding God. And that was what drove the great thinkers of the scientific revolution. But it also led people to see nature as this kind of desacralized place that if the soul and this eternal transcendent realm was what was the source of sacredness, it just meant the world was this material resource for our consumption. And if what made humans so special was our soul or our reason, it just meant that animals were basically just kind of machines that we could do what we wanted with too. And they had no soul, so it didn't really matter. There was for animals, suffering wasn't the same thing as suffering for humans. Yeah. So there was this core distinction between humans and the rest of the world that we are living in right now.
I read somewhere that Descartes, who, really had this view that anything that was not human was just sort of mechanistic in a way. And there's a story of him actually dissecting live dogs and poking around in their hearts because he just thought they wouldn't suffer because they had no soul.
Yes,
and not in a heartless way. Perhaps he just thought they were machines. He couldn't see. He couldn't empathize with the dog.
Yes, I know. It's really quite awful to consider, and I've come across that story too. And I know it's an interesting question. This question of what is heartless or whatever, because we can assume that Descartes was, a warm, caring human being who loved those around him and everything. And so it gets to be this really core question, is to try to understand how our cultural presumptions, the things that we take for granted without even considering them, can lead us to act in ways that might be considered by other cultures to be absolutely cruel and inhumane, when we just figure, well, that's okay because that's our norms. Yeah. And you know, I mean, it's quite possible that future generations will look back at even those of us who see ourselves as progressive and you know, focused on the good things in life now, and just say, how could they have eaten meat, or how could they have done certain things that we think of as being part of human norms now, but which may be really just what we've inherited from the past. Sure.
Well, I suppose we have to be careful not to demonize dualistic thinking, because it has brought lots of benefits too. But you do seem to make the connection with the fact that when you think dualistically, you are in a sense disconnected, and also that a lot of the problems that we're facing today, you know, especially with regard to the environment and biodiversity loss, and the whole epidemic of depression and all these challenges that we're facing today, have a connection with this pattern of thought.
Yes, and I agree with you, and I think it's so important. I'm glad you raised this question of sort of not demonizing that more dualistic way of thinking. And something I do in my book is I try to look at it from the perspectives of the good and the bad that dualistic thinking has brought, because it really was the foundation for the reductionist approach to science, which has given us all the technology and the understandings of health, to the extent that the quality really of the quality of life of billions of us around the world have improved as a result of these sort of detailed understandings of nature that thinking has brought. So it's very important that we stay aware of that. But I think the key point is to where you were going on that, is that has become such a powerful way of making sense of the universe that it's led to this incredible imbalance between human power and the rest of the world, and an imbalance in our own human thinking between that reductionist, separationist kind of view of things and a more holistic and connected view. Yeah. And so I think that what we can really focus our emphasis on is not to say get rid of dualism or get rid of reductionism and replace it with holistic thinking, but find a more of a balance. How can we integrate that dualistic and reductionist thought that is so important and powerful with a recognition of our intrinsic connectedness with everything around us, a recognition of the systems, understanding of how, really understanding even scientifically how systems work so that things are connected. And what does connection actually mean, rather than just being a word?
Okay, well, you mentioned some interesting things there, the term integration, which we can come to later on, and also systems thinking. Now, that's very much connected with the other stream of thought that we were talking about earlier, that maybe started when we were hunter-gatherers, but reached a real flourishing, a real flowering in China, especially during the Song dynasty. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what the connection is with systems thinking?
Yes, they're really big topics there, which I really explore in a lot through the book, because I find that so fascinating. And just to sort of touch on hunter-gatherers as a foundation of this, that when we look at that hunter-gatherer worldview that served as the foundation for all different worldviews going forward, it was the sense of everything being connected, and the sense of nature as really like a giving mother and father, and the spirits around as all being part of one big family. And whereas in the West we saw this split develop with the ancient Greeks, in traditional China, what's so fascinating is that they developed a very sophisticated, systematic view of how the universe worked that didn't actually make that break with hunter-gatherer understanding. And it really kind of explored how things can be connected and unified and differentiated at the same time. So they developed in the Neo-Confucian Sung dynasty, about 1,000 years or so ago, they developed what I find one of the most fascinating and brilliant syntheses of cosmology in all of history, because they took the strands. You'd have 1,000 years in Chinese history of three different cosmologies, if you will. There was Taoism, there was Confucianism, both of which were originally Chinese, and you had Buddhism, which migrated from India but became a very significant part of Chinese thought. And what the Neo-Confucians did in around 1000 AD was to integrate these three into this systematic way of understanding things. And in simple terms, what they said was that all of the universe is filled with qi, which I'm sure many people who are listening will know that word, which really is the Chinese word for both sort of energy and matter. All the physical stuff of the universe, whether it's actually you can touch it or you just or the energy of it. But equally importantly, the qi had to be organized, and the principles of organization that linked the qi together in all the different ways we see in the universe, they had a word for that was Li, which basically can just be translated as principles of organization. And it's how the qi expresses itself through the Li, which is what forms this amazing complexity of the universe. And they saw those principles ultimately building up in a fractal way, if you will, to form the entire connection of things, which they really saw as the Tao. And what I found so interesting as I was doing a lot of my research is while I was discovering this traditional Chinese way of understanding things, I was reading a lot of modern complexity theorists, systems thinkers, people like Fritjof Capra or Stuart Kauffman. And Stuart Kauffman was somebody who would talk about, we're discovering in complexity theory that it's all, the universe is really about how things connect up. But what are these principles of organization? That's what we need to discover. We're breaking new territory, trying to make sense of them. And here I was reading how these Neo-Confucians 1,000 years ago were coming up with I see is pretty much exactly the same concept with Li. So that's where I see what's so exciting is that through the insights of modern systems thinking that looks at the really deep analysis of how things interconnect, we see a relation between that and traditional wisdom that offers us insights from thousands of years of brilliant, deeply understood traditions, also looking at how things connect up.
We touched on the idea earlier that this reductionist, dualistic view of things is getting us into trouble. So in what way can systems theory, as you say, integrate with this more dualistic way of thinking?
Yes, I really appreciate your focus on not seeing this kind of battle of one versus the other or replacing one with the other, but looking at harmonizing or integrating these different worldviews into something more valuable for all of us. And thank you for that. And so I do think that right now we live in a world where that reductionist, dualistic mindset has absolute dominance. And so much so that the vast bulk of people in our world today don't even consider that there's any other way of looking at things. So we take for granted things like this notion that humans are split between mind and body, or this notion that humans are separate from nature, or this idea of looking at nature as this resource that's there for humans to optimize. Even to the extent that when some people looking at climate change are ready to consider this notion of geoengineering, actually seeing the Earth as one gigantic machine to be engineered in order to sort of optimize for human population going forward. So, and along with that, we live in a world where we've created a corporate consumerist mentality that dominates all of our values. So we set in place this almost I see it sometimes like an artificial intelligence that we created hundreds of years ago, of setting up corporations whose sole reason it is to maximize the rate at which we take nature's resources and turn it into a monetized economy and turn human activity into a monetized economy. And virtually all of us are slaves to that like onslaught that we get, which really leads to what the values that are leading us to this imbalance and potentially to catastrophe for our civilization. So if we look at that on one hand, it becomes incredibly important to find a way not just to sort of come up with incremental fixes like, well, we need to invest in green energy, or we need to, have another some environmental reserve for this or that. Those are all good things to do. But at the deepest levels, we need to look at a different foundation of where we get our values from, leading to different ways in which we as humans live our lives and how we organize our society. And I do think that systems view of the world, seeing everything as being interconnected, is a great foundation that can really lead us towards more of a balance, because it can recognize our connectedness within ourselves, connectedness with all other humans around us on the earth, and our connectedness with the earth, that we're not separate from nature, but we are nature.
I don't know if you've ever come across the economist Tim Jackson. He wrote a book called Prosperity Without Growth. And one of the points he makes is that the whole idea of prosperity, it's only relatively recently that we've almost solely associated it with acquisition and opulence, that it was a lot more associated from a big part of history with human flourishing. And similar to what you're saying, that perhaps we need to change the social logic about this whole idea that prosperity is just to do with acquiring.
I think that is just so true. And in fact, if you look back at how our nomadic hunter-gatherer ancestors lived, then there's a very predominant theory among cognitive anthropologists that they were really the original affluent society, to your point, that if you consider affluence just sort of how much time you're spending on just sort of getting food and shelter, and how much time you get to spend on all other things, socializing and art and just enjoying, relaxing. Yeah. Their ratio is fabulous, maybe a few hours a day at most on survival needs, and everything else is spent on just enjoying their lives, because they don't have that need for consumer possessions. And they also don't recognize their status based on how they're doing in the pecking order versus somebody else around them, but actually how they're doing in their community, how they're viewed within their community. So I think that one of the things that we can focus on, to your point, is really what can we do to improve the quality of our lives rather than the quantity of the stuff that we consume. Yeah. I think that is absolutely key to moving forward to a flourishing future. And it goes against the messages that are pounded in us all the time from media, from our internet media, but also just mass communications media and the values we receive at work. And basically everything around us is telling us, as part of this mainstream society, you should earn more, consume more, go on fancy holidays, everything else like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then how would such a change in values be different from the great transitions of the past, like the agricultural revolution or the scientific revolution?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those two, because I do think that what we're talking about would be such a transformation in values that it would be of the scale of those two, in that it would really change what the whole human experience is about. So quite a fundamental change. But one way in which it would be different from those past two is that this is one where that transformation would have to happen from our consciously recognizing the need for it to happen. So when people first developed agriculture, for example, or first developed scientific thought, each person was doing their thing and not realizing they were part of this amazing shift in human behavior that would lead to this kind of paradigm shift. But we right now are in a place where we don't have the time for anything other than really major shifts in our thinking that are part of our conscious orientation. And my hope is that the kind of work that I offer in a book like The Patterning Instinct is to help people to start to look at what are our underlying patterns of cognition, patterns of meaning that we take from the world. And each of us really has to begin that transformation in ourselves by looking at the ways in which we take things for granted. What are we doing? What are we implicitly acting on that might be part of that destructive worldview that we can shift ourselves? Yeah. And how can that relate to everything else around us?
I imagine a lot of people listening like this idea, but look at the world and see what's happening in the world and feel either daunted or perhaps even cynical about how we could actually go about making such a massive transition. What reasons do you think could make that transition possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've come across that sort of cynical view many times. People saying, look, this kind of stuff, it'd be great to happen, but it never will. And a lot of the time it's based on these false presumptions that are part of this dualistic worldview. Like, well, in the end, humans are all ultimately selfish, and that's just what drives everything anyway, which is actually just another myth that we've inherited from that dualistic worldview. But more to the point, I think, is that what we see when we look at history is that change, when it happens, is oftentimes non-linear. That history is not a matter of just kind of following a straight line and seeing it continue to go in that same direction. But when there are shifts in cognitive perceptions around, it's just amazing how rapidly you can have shifts in norms that totally undermine what has been there before. A great example is the abolition of slavery, where just a couple of hundred years ago, people would have said, the whole world system is based on this thing. You can't just get rid of slavery. Everything will collapse if you try to do that. And just a few people starting out saying, no, this is wrong. This is morally wrong, changed the very foundations of the world economy. And you see something similar. It's hard to believe, but it was just 100 years ago. In the most advanced countries in the world, women didn't have the vote. They had to fight. And it was like almost this ridiculous fight because there were so few of them. It was laughable that they could ever have the power to change the norms of the world. And yet within a few decades, and now of course, just the very notion is unthinkable that they could not have the vote. And similarly, and we see that happening right now in things like the acceptance out of the blue of same-sex marriage in many advanced countries around the world that people thought could never happen. And even in the Me Too movement, we see we're in the middle of this beginning of this shift right now where people who thought they could never be touched, and these kind of alpha males in these big corporate spheres suddenly getting toppled because of this grassroots movement. So we can see this happening all the time. And we can think of it almost like a mycelial network, just like in a forest where trees' roots connect with each other under the earth, and shifts are happening. But when you're walking on top of the earth, you don't even see it. And similarly, we read the news headlines every day. That's the sort of top level stuff, and everything looks so disastrous. But what we don't read about every day is kind of news like, today, 50,000 people around the world became aware of climate change and vowed they were going to do things differently in their lives around that. That's the kind of stuff that's happening all the time, but you only see it when a nonlinear shift starts taking place.
Yeah, very much agree with that. 2 points there, actually. I mean, what gives me hope is the recognition that cultural change happens on a vastly faster scale than evolutionary change. And a similar example was that apparently in the UK in 1980, they did a survey about homosexuality, and 65% of people in the UK at that time thought homosexuality was unnatural. They did a survey 30 years later, 70% of people think it's perfectly normal. People under 20, 90%, what's all the bloody fuss about? And that's a massive change in 30 years. Those are the sort of things that give me hope. And then at that point you made about the negative news, I'm sure you're very interested in the whole cognitive bias theory too. And one of the very strong biases that we have is the negativity bias. we're a lot more attuned, say from a hunter-gathering perspective, to the fact that there might be a saber-toothed tiger in that valley rather than some strawberries in this one.
Right.
And that sells newspapers. But there is a lot of good news out there as well. But it's hard to find that at times.
It is, that's all true. And yet, let me add another layer. Having said all that, something that I struggle with a lot myself is that when we look at many of these cultural shifts, what we see is that it seems like it's a lot easier to shift culture than it is to shift the economic structure of global capitalism. So much so that it's almost like global capitalism with its one almost pathological drive to maximize shareholder value can absorb all these cultural shifts, but still continue to grow at a faster and faster rate and destroy the natural resources at that rate. So that even when we have things like women getting more empowered in the world, or different norms that are accepted, the global capitalist model goes, great. We've got a new market, we'll advertise in a new way now, we'll be hip, and we'll still keep growing and destroying the earth to monetize it. So I think our big challenge that I see is to take these shifts that we're talking about, this ability of us as human beings to connect with each other in this really core human way, with human values, and to translate that into the economic sphere, and to say we've got to do things that undermine the power of this global corporate model, which is, I really see almost like as if it's an alien invasion that is sucking the life out of humanity and the earth, and continues to do that at a bigger and bigger scale.
Sure.
And I really see that as a real focused challenge for all of us who care about future generations and the natural world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes so much sense to me, Jeremy. And you explore a lot of these challenges in something you've set up called the Liology Institute. Am I pronouncing that correctly, by the way?
You are.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And so you might remember, as we were talking before, that traditional Chinese way of synthesizing the universe looked at what they called the Li as the organizing principles of the universe. And I set up this Liology Institute a few years back as a nonprofit, sort of way of exploring how can we develop a worldview that, in the word of Liology, like investigates these organizing principles of the universe, and specifically in a way that integrates all the different parts of our human experience. So integrating traditional wisdom with modern science, integrating our mental and our embodied experiences, integrating the sense of spiritual meaning with scientific investigation, integrating like modern systems thinking in terms of how we actually live our values every day. So it's a framework for integration. And the idea is that maybe over the long term, it can help to establish the foundations for a worldview as an alternative to this destructive one that is currently got its stranglehold on the world right now, that could lead to a long-term harmonious flourishing on the earth.
Okay, well, I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be interested in that. And also, perhaps they might be interested in something else that we talked about earlier, the fact that you're coming over to the UK in the summer. Could you tell us what your plans are there?
Yes, that's right. And I'm very excited about this because I'll be offering a week-long course actually on the themes we've been talking about today, the themes of the patterning instinct at Schumacher College at Tutness in Devon, that I'm sure many of your listeners will be quite familiar with. And the course is going to be called Recognizing and Reshaping Our Patterns of Meaning. And it's going to be going from Monday, 11th of June to Friday, the 15th of June. And we're going to be doing like a deep sort of embodied immersion into the themes that we've been looking at here, looking at where we get our meaning from and what are alternative ways in which we can actually find meaning and how we can live that in our embodied existence and how we can take that into the world to really help to reshape those patterns. So I'm excited about what we can do together in a week. And the course is up there on the schumachercollege.org.uk website. So if anyone's interested, you can find out more about it there.
Yeah, well, on the YouTube slideshow, I'll also create some links there and show how people can access that. Okay, my last question, Jeremy, it's the question I always ask people in every interview. What is your understanding of the middle way in relation to what we've been talking about today?
I think when I think of the idea of the middle way, I think about it above all in terms of this notion of integration, which to me feels like so rich and so important, because I think of integration as basically this recognition of unity with diversity. And this recognition of how everything is one and connected, and also everything has its own unique way of being part of that interconnected whole, that all the different parts all create the whole, and the whole actually works on the parts. So I think integration is, to my mind, the way in which we can, it's sort of almost like the middle way expanding out to the edges. So the edges become part of the middle become part of the whole. And everything, it's not that it becomes one in some sort of amorphous jelly-like sort of substance way, but it's like every one of us can express our individuality the most when we're embedded and integrated in part of everything around us. And all the different parts of our being can really be growing to the fullest extent when they're integrated in part of what we are as a human being too.
Fantastic. Okay, well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and really fascinating. And I'll continue to follow your work with great interest. And good luck with the Liology Institute. And you never know, I might see if I can get along in June.
That would be fabulous, Barry. I'd love to see you there, and any of your listeners who are interested. And thank you so much. Just a tremendously enjoyable conversation.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.